This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Down, I'm moving too fast.
This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
Additional support provided by
Get to know Proximity Malt. We malt superior, European-style, low-protein varieties grown close to home in Delaware and Colorado. Domestically grown, precisely malted to style. With our team of seasoned experts and 2 brand-new malt houses, try what's really new in malt. Check us out at www.proximitymalt.com.
And I think for years, people have focused on the hydrocarbons because they're there in such great abundance. But because they are hydrocarbons, they're not water soluble. They really don't want to be in solution, and they tend not to be flavor important for most beers.
This week on the show, a couple of papers from the Master Brewers Technical Quarterly by Scott LaFontaine and Tom Shellhammer that help us navigate the complexities of hop aroma and make better beer. Tom, those who've been with us since the very beginning will remember you and Dan Vollmer on the very first episode challenging the conventional wisdom that using hops with higher oil content for dry hopping would result in increased aroma. Remind us how you came to that conclusion.
Yeah, so it's sort of intuitive to think that if hop aroma comes from hop oil, which it does, then having hops with higher hop aroma or higher oil should have higher aroma. And so this project that Dan Vollmer and I worked on a number of years back was trying to probe that very question. And what we discovered, kind of to our surprise, was that hop oil in and of itself is not a really good predictor of hop aroma intensity. And the caveat is that this is within a particular variety. And the varieties we looked at when we did this study were Cascade, Centennial, and Chinook. And we really have the most data on the Cascade. So a sample of Cascade that's high in total oil might not necessarily be predictive of it being high in aroma intensity relative to a counterpart which was lower in oil. And so the next question is then, well, if it's not total oil, then what is it? And start digging what's in the oil, and are there components in the oil that tend to be more flavor potent or flavor important than total oil itself? And there was, and this is work that Scott LaFontaine did for his doctoral work, a big portion of it, among other projects that Scott worked on. And I'll let Scott tell more about that. But the general sort of analogy is that when you look at the total resin content in hops, and if you're trying to use that as a predictor for bitterness, we know that the alpha acids are really the things to focus on. They're the precursors to isoalpha acids, which are the main driver of bitterness. And so looking at total resin content would not necessarily be totally predictive of bitterness, because you have these other things that don't necessarily contribute to bitterness. And so I think we were uncovering the same sort of phenomena with oil, that you could almost think of there's components in the oil that could be considered filler or just less flavor important than others. And we could use that as a predictive tool around the aromatic performance of hops.
Let's talk about the components of hop oil that influence aroma in beer. There's sort of 3 categories here, right?
So there's the hydrocarbons, which is and sesquiterpenes, which would be like myrcene and alpha-humulene, are kind of some poster childs there. And then you have the oxygenated compounds, which would be like, again, some poster childs are linalool and geraniol. And then some kind of newer age compounds that people are looking at are these sulfur-containing compounds, which would be like 4-MMP would be the indicator, or 3-MHA. And what's interesting about these is that hops in themselves are described like when you do a rub, 70% of that oil is coming from the hydrocarbon fraction, so myrcene and alpha-humulene, and these are woody and kind of herbal notes. And then kind of when you look at kettle hop aroma, linalool has been kind of the target oxygenated compound that people have been looking at as the driver. And so a lot of prior work has pointed to linalool as being an important compound. And what we found in our work is actually another compound, geraniol, actually explained a lot of the variation within the dry hop flavor that we were looking at with Cascade. So this fraction is pretty important in terms of a driver of aroma intensity. And then when you start looking at the sulfur-containing compounds, these are fairly difficult to look at analytically because they're in such low concentrations, and there are only a handful of labs that can measure them. So we're starting to uncover and peel back the onion of the importance of these compounds. And in our studies, we've shown a couple of interesting things with them as well.
Just one thing to mention, and we often discuss this when we're talking about these findings, is that like this compound geraniol that seemed to be an important predictor of aroma potential in Cascade, in and of itself is not the sole descriptor of Cascade hop aroma. Cascade hop aroma in beer is much more complicated than just one compound. But in terms of using some sort of indicator within hops that might give you a sense of whether this sample of hops is going to be high or low, it's called potency in terms of its aromatic punch, geraniol does a better job than total oil content in terms of that sort of prediction.
Terpenes, which is that first group that we mentioned, makes up a huge percentage of hop oil, but aren't believed to be contributors to dry hopped aroma. Why is that? So
this really comes down to the way the molecule is structured. In it's kind of complex because in these newer style New England IPAs, as you see at the end of this publication, as you change the matrix, these molecules may be important. But in filtered beer, where there's not much hydrophobic or lipophobic material in solution, the way that these compounds are structured makes it such that they're not very soluble in solution. And they're going to want to be on yeast cells or stay within the plant matter, or leading on CO2 during fermentation. So you can kind of think about it that they really don't want to be at the party in terms of being in solution. And so because of their properties, that they're not really the main drivers. Whereas if you're going to just take hops and do a rub, because they make such a large proportion of that oil, they're going to be predominantly like in your face during that rub. So they're probably more of a driver of hops themselves than the dry hop aroma that you're going to find in beer.
But we do think that terpenes are important for kettle hop additions, right?
Yeah. So during those kettle hop additions, what can happen is that these compounds can oxidize, and then they become more soluble, or they start to become their structure changes so that they oxygenate, and then they become like the sesquiterpene oxides. They're the components that have been found by other scientists to lead to these spicy notes that you're finding. So that's kind of what's going on there, is that they're changing structure during that boiling process and then becoming more important.
I think that, just repeating what Scott was saying, the hydrocarbon fraction, when you are analyzing total oil, you find it in greatest abundance. And so it's hard not to miss it. And I think for years people have focused on the hydrocarbons because they're there in such great abundance. But because they are hydrocarbons, they're not water soluble. They really don't want to be in solution, and they tend not to be flavor important for most beers. As Scott points out, beers like a New England style IPA, where you've just essentially overloaded the system with hops, you can actually find them in suspension, but they're not truly solubilized.
You already brought up linalool, which was the first hop volatile measured above its threshold. Talk about why dry hopping doesn't seem to move the linalool needle, whereas both wort boiling and hop storage do.
As Scott pointed out, linalool for quite a while was kind of a standout hop component that people focused on for hoppy aroma, and the work that that sort of exposed that was done in kettle hop beers, principally kettle hop German beers, although it's an oversimplification. And I think it's an important compound from kettle hopping, as are some of the other oxygenated compounds like geraniol and nerol. But in dry hop beers, we're seeing there are two things going on. One, there's much lower heat and hence lower volatilization of the hop components. And two, there's much higher amounts of hop material being added to beer than there would be in a kettle hop addition. And so we start seeing other hop components becoming important in terms of both non-volatile, like bitterness, and volatile contributions in terms of flavor.
How about storage? Do you want to talk about that at all? How that's affecting linalool?
No.
Okay. Fair enough.
No.
That's a good answer. I like that answer.
I don't have enough. We haven't done enough work in that area.
This TQ paper has a really cool diagram that illustrates the complexity of biotransformation, and I like how you've included detection thresholds for many of these compounds, as well as references to the studies that uncovered the various reactions. Take a few minutes to drive us around Figure 3.
So, like I said before, geraniol seemed to be the marker for Cascade. And like I said, it only described 50% of the variation, but it was doing a far better job at describing the aroma potential of Cascade than total essential oil, which really only described 30% of the variation that we were seeing between our different cultivars. And so when you start to look at geraniol, there's a number of different things that are feeding or changing the concentration, or could change the concentration depending on the type of dry hopping parameters that you're using within your system. And so King et al. Was kind of the first to show that these biotransformations can happen, and that yeast has an ability to affect the geraniol concentration. And what I find really interesting is that as you start to change the geraniol concentration, you're starting to change the detection threshold, as well as the type of aroma quality that you're getting from the compound. And so if we just look at the King study, and this would be going north within the figure, they saw that yeast can isomerize geraniol into beta-citronellol. And so you would be going from kind of a rosy note to more of a citrus-based note. And then further, it could be esterified into citronella acetate. And so you can see that that's one pathway. But the geraniol concentration can also be fed by glucosides. And a number of people have talked about this. But there have been studies that have been done in our lab by Dr. Sharp, as well as in Sonia Collins' lab, that showed that the proportion that glycosides are actually attributing to beer is rather small. So that might be kind of a smaller input. That's something that this chart doesn't show, is like, where is the most important thing? And then the plant itself and this is kind of the lower part of the graph, going to geraniol and then methyldranate, can affect the geraniol concentration within the plant, or within the plant, the geraniol concentration can change as well. So this would be varietal differences. And so knowing which variety you want to dry hop with is pretty important if geraniol is an indicator of flavor.
Your article suggests a strategy for maximizing hop aroma potential by reserving geraniol-rich hops and geraniol precursor dominant hops for different applications. Talk about that.
Yeah, so this was a strategy that a scientist in Japan, Dr. Takoi, was recommending, and it kind of fell in line with what we were seeing in Cascade, that the higher free geraniol Cascade was attributing more intense aroma to beer. And when you start to look at the different varieties and compare their geraniol concentrations, which was what Takoi's work was doing, he kind of lumped he had two classes, geraniol rich and geraniol precursor. And the geraniol rich hops, because there's more of that free volatile there, they probably lend themselves more to dry hopping because of the fact that there's more extractable geraniol there. Now, just something to note is that our studies were done, we kind of made beer teas. And so we were dry hopping a based unhopped beer that had no yeast in it. And that might be different than a number of commercial breweries that may be dry hopping on yeast. And so geraniol itself became important in our study. But if you were dry hopping on yeast, you could see that probably, and this was in Takoi's work, he dry hops mostly on yeast. You're going to see that beta citronellol is more important because you're going to get that bio transformation. And so just an important note, when you're looking at these studies, you need to consider how the researchers are performing their work so that you can make an apples to apples comparison, and that so that you have an idea of how it relates to the system that you're working in at your brewery. I think that's an important point to make here. Sorry for the aside, but what we found is that if you use geraniol free, you get more extractable geraniol, and the aroma goes up. But if you had to use the geraniol precursor hops, you can maybe use them more upstream within the process. And then fermentation and yeast could act on those precursors and release the flavor compounds that you're looking for. So maybe use those geraniol precursor hops more upstream in the process in whirlpool additions or kettle hop additions.
Scott, you mentioned earlier that there have been some limitations studying that last group of the 3 volatile fractions of hop oil that we mentioned at the beginning. Talk about those challenges, and let's hear what we're learning about thiols.
The challenge here is that you have, you're trying to find the top of the pinhead in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. And so what we have now is we're kind of, you might have had, these compounds might have been having an effect for a very long time, but technologically and from a methodology standpoint, we might not have had the instrumentation to actually really look at these chemicals reproducibly or it had the instrument with the sensitivity to look for these compounds. But now what you see is that instrumentation is catching up to what we're seeing and what might be affecting flavor. And we have a number of labs that are coming out with really great studies on thiols. What we're starting to see is similar to the terpenes, is that you do have these free volatiles and a bound portion. And a lot of this work is really being driven by the wine industry. And we're kind of using what they're finding in the wine industry and seeing how that is how hops are similar and might be different. And so the way there's three thiols that are kind of jump out as important. Two are produced by hops, Form MP and 3MH, which Form MP is 4-mercapto, 4-methyl pentane, 2-one, and 3-mercapto hexanol. And then the 3-mercapto hexanol can be converted to the acetate, which is the 3-MHA during fermentation or dry hopping on yeast to 3-MHA. So the 3-MHA is actually, a number of studies have shown that that's kind of more of a yeast-derived flavor. But those are the three poster childs, the Form MP, the 3-MHA, and the 3MH. And the Form MP and the 3MH are being produced by the hop, and the 3MHA is more of a yeast-derived compound.
And to give you some perspective from like an odor detection threshold, the terpenes, so this used linalool, geraniol, have odor detection thresholds in the high parts per billion or low parts per million, let's say like 100 parts per billion, while the thiols typically have aroma detection thresholds in the parts per trillion, like single parts per trillion. So you're several orders of magnitude away in terms of potency. That is, the thiols are much, much more potent. So even though they're there in hops in really, really small amounts, they are much more flavor active, thousands of times more flavor active than the terpenes and even greater than the hydrocarbons.
That's interesting. Thanks for pointing that out.
And just like the free geraniol and free precursor, another researcher, Aurélie Roland, showed that there was thiol precursor rich hops and free thiol rich hops. So like Satz, Halotol, Perle, and Calypso would be like the high precursor hops. And again, you might want to use those more upstream in the process, Whirlpool or dry hopping additions, or Whirlpool or kettle hop additions. Whereas the free thiol versions or varieties like Bravo, Citra, Simcoe, you might want to use as dry hopping.
And those particular, those varieties, that the last handful that Scott talked about, when people smell those or smell beers made with those, you're smelling those characteristic thiols, which are gooseberry, lychee, some people refer to it as caddy, tropical, sweaty kind of aromas. So they're fairly distinctive. And beers that are made with lots of Mosaic or Simcoe or Citra tend to have these type of thiol. I mean, they're not really a stink, but they're a tropical, almost animal-y quality to them, which could be polarizing. I mean, some people love them, some people don't.
Coming up.
So what we found is that as you picked up Cascade later, it was higher in free thiols and lower in precursors. Or on the flip side, if you picked it earlier, it would be higher in precursors and lower in free thiols.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Support for this podcast is brought to you by
ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery and parts outfitter. From our Raleigh headquarters to our Denver office, we proudly offer brew houses and fermenters from 3 barrels and up, yeast brinks, boilers, kegs, chillers, tri-clamp, and other stainless parts, all with the quickest delivery and lead times in the industry. Learn more at abs-commercial.com or call 877-BREW-ABS. ABS Commercial. We are brewers.
Additional support provided by
Bring the world to your brewhouse with BSG's diverse selection of ingredients and services. Our dedicated customer service team and industry experience provides you with the assistance you need every step of the way. Make BSG your supplier of choice with products essential to making great artisanal beverages so you can stay focused on your craft. Visit us at bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact us at 1-800-374-2739.
And thanks also to
Malt Europe Malting Company is a leading supplier of craft malt across North America. As a farmer-owned company, Malt Europe has carefully crafted quality malt from locally grown barley for decades. The result? A portfolio of base, specialty, and distillers malts that exceed the exacting standards of craft brewers. Learn more and buy online at malteuropemaltingco.com.
Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. District New England meets at Northwoods Brewing October 11th. District Philly goes to the Pennsylvania Renaissance Fair October 12th. New Hampshire Brewfest 2019 is October 12th in Portsmouth. District Pittsburgh meets October 15th. District Michigan meets at Arbor Brewing October 17th. District St. Louis meets October 17th, and the brand new District Georgia is holding its first annual pig roast October 19th at Monday Night Brewing in Atlanta. District Mid-Atlantic meets October 19th at Union Craft Brewing in Baltimore. Registration is now open for the 2019 Master Brewers Conference in Calgary. Be sure to tack on a couple of extra days to enjoy some amazing hiking and make the 45-minute trip to Banff, which is one of the most picturesque places on the planet. And immediately following the conference is the world-famous Master Brewers 2-week Brewing and Malting Science course in Madison, Wisconsin. Check out the full calendar of events at mbaa.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. Thiols can easily be oxidized. Does that mean they might not play as big a role in hop aroma after all as they could?
I think with the challenge with hop chemistry is that it's fairly complex, and you've got a whole bunch of different compounds interacting with each other. I think hop oxidation definitely has an impact on hop aroma intensity, and we're talking about hop oxidation during storage. Certainly, beer oxidation post-hoppiness, post-production, has an even bigger impact on hoppy flavor. That is, hops that are aged, if they're stored properly, hops that are aged 6 months, a year, and stored cold are not going to be that aromatically different. But beer, even if beer is stored cold but is exposed to oxygen during dry hopping or during filtration or packaging, we see a pretty dramatic loss in the hoppiness. And I would suspect that is a combination of thiol oxidation as well as some transformation of the terpene fraction.
Has anybody measured that?
We haven't measured it. Okay, well, so there was a study that Brad Barnett carried out in our lab 2 years ago, looking at changes in hoppiness in a dry hopped beer as a result of dissolved oxygen levels at the time of packaging. And what we found is that oxygen certainly had a big impact in terms of hop aroma decay, but temperature and time had an even bigger effect. And in general, the beers that we were looking at would go from being bright, floral, fruity, hoppy, and move into this sort of caramelly fruitcake kind of flavor. And while oxidation, that is the dissolved oxygen levels at packaging, certainly resulted in differences in speed with which that occurred when they're stored cold, when they were stored warm. It was just like a dramatic shift that swamped out the oxidation component. So the take-home message is that hoppy beers just don't age terribly well.
Talk about the work you did comparing different lots of Cascade and Centennial from the same harvest.
This study, what we were doing was looking over multiple harvest years at a number of different lots of Cascade. And I think over the study, we looked at I think 70 different lots of Cascade, or maybe the same lot occurred over the 3 years that we were looking at this project, but a significant number of different lots of the commercially available Cascade. And what we would do is sort of make hop teas in an unhopped based pale ale. That pale ale had been iso-hopped so that we could look at interactions, or if an interaction would happen with, let's say, iso-alpha acid. We had some in there as to account for some of those differences, or microbial stability as well. And what we would do is we would have panelists rate the overall aroma intensity increase across those different kind of beer hop teas. And what we'd also do is then extract the essential oil and then characterize that oil into the different chemical classes. And what we found, as I've mentioned, is that for Cascade, geraniol seemed to explain 50% of the variation within our data set. And that means that as the intensity was increasing across the different treatments, geraniol seemed to be a pretty good indicator of that aroma intensity increase, more so than essential oil, which really didn't explain much of their variation within that sensory, only 30%. And so you got an increase in the explanation power by just using geraniol for Cascade. What was interesting is that for Centennial, that marker seemed to be beta-pinene, although it explained only about 40% of the variation within the data set, as compared to essential oil, which I think for Centennial was more around 25%. So what's interesting about beta-pinene is that because it's a hydrocarbon, it's probably not the driver of Centennial's flavor, but it might be a marker of what actually is driving Centennial's flavor, if that makes sense. And Centennial is interesting from a beta-pinene standpoint because it's one of the only varieties that has that biosynthetic pathway. So it's high in beta-pinene, and maybe that because it's high in that, it has that biosynthetic pathway. Maybe it's producing something else that we're not measuring. Because over our study, we were only looking at 15 volatiles, which the essential oil is made up of hundreds of compounds. So we could have been missing something there.
You also wrote about the non-volatile fraction and some unintended consequences of dry hopping. What's going on there?
Yeah, so while I was working on my kind of on the Aroma side, there was another graduate student in the program, Christina Hahn, who was working on sort of describing the dry hop bitterness the bitterness that you're getting picked up with dry hopping. And this is kind of in Tom's lab, there's kind of like this history, right? So Christina was taking after another student. And so we were trying to figure out what were the drivers of this dry hop beer bitterness. And it seemed like after looking at 120 different commercially available craft beers, most, I would say 70% of those were hoppy or hop forward, that humulinones and iso-alpha acids are really the main primary drivers of bitterness in those beers. And so with humulinones, essentially, it's an oxidation product in hops. And so alpha acids are oxidizing into humulinones. And those humulinones, if they're in hops, they're 90% extractable into beer. And so they're going to be driving beer flavor. And so thinking about this in the brewery, one suggestion that I've been thinking about on how to like kind of mitigate this is, as a craft brewery, you might want to buy your hops based upon your recipe or design your recipes based upon purchasable quantities of hops, so that you don't just open a bag of hops and leave them sitting there. Maybe open the bag and use the whole bag, so that you're not having this bitterness pickup would be a possible strategy. But considering that bitterness pickup is important. And you could also dial down your kettle hop additions, knowing that you're going to get this bitterness boost from the humulinones. So thinking that there's more coming in than just aroma, I think, is important. And now that we kind of know what the drivers are, you can start to measure that as well.
There's a frightening possibility related to manganese extraction during dry hopping. Talk about that.
Yeah, this is kind of complex, though. So thinking about it, and this is really this non-volatile component is really, I think, driven by the sheer amount of hops that people are putting into beer now. Because as you increase this hopping rate, another student that I was working with, Dean Hauser, found that 34%, that hops are 34% extractable solids. And so that is only a portion of that is essential oil. And then the other portion is all these other things, right? Like the humulinones, these metals, alpha acids. And when we're thinking about the metals, these manganese is being extracted. So a paper by Banforth showed that it can be extracted at high rates. And then another presentation that was done, I think, at last year's annual ASBC meeting in San Diego, Reyes, who works for Sierra Nevada Brewing Company, observed that metal composition can change based upon where you are getting your hops from. And so thinking about that, potentially certain growing regions or these metal ion concentrations could lead to a greater staling effect. And that might dictate how you want to use these hops. And this is just kind of theoretical right now. Nobody's shown this, but you might want to use hops high in that manganese more upstream in the brewing process. So again, use them in the whirlpool or during kettle hopping, and then yeast could assimilate that metal or use it as nutrients. But to complicate that, another study done by Wheatstock found that alpha acids can actually sequester some of these metals, so iron or copper, which are really the main primary drivers of that oxidative formation.
There's a paragraph in there talking about water-soluble aroma precursors being important when hops are added in the presence of yeast. Do you want to unpack that a little bit more?
So this is kind of going back to that bound versus free discussion.
Okay.
And so the bound precursors are kind of those glucosides, or the bound thiol that would be it's sort of, I don't think we know exactly the biochemistry yet, but what's happening in grapes is that it's this fatty acid degradation pathway. And so the thiols are coming out attached to both cysteine and glutathione. And different yeast strains have different abilities or different enzymatic packages that may cleave those precursors from, or cleave the volatile from those precursors. And so thinking back, right, variety has an impact on precursor. So you have varieties that produce high levels of free compounds and varieties that produce high levels of precursors. And so as a brewer, that's a choice you can make. you have the varietal choice. But also what we found in a study that I did with Haas and Scott Barnum at Haas, who is one of their growers, is that in our kind of all the cascades we were looking at, he was, over the 3 years that I was working on this project, he would pick hops at 5 different time points over those harvests. And what we found is that within Cascade, and we were only looking at one variety here, is that Cascade had the ability to regulate the free thiol concentration and precursor concentration. So what we found is that as you picked Cascade later, it was higher in free thiols and lower in precursors. On the flip side, if you picked it earlier, it would be higher in precursors and lower in free thiols. So kind of thinking about that and like the challenges in the industry right now is that you really only have a month to get the hops out of the yard, right? And so I think growers are kind of constrained because they're time limited. And so my thought is that if you really can use this precursor concentration as a driver of when you should use hops throughout the brewing process, you can maybe use it as a like when to pick, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. I'm not sure if we captured it and all that, but you're basically suggesting that those late harvested hops would be preferable for dry hopping, whereas the early ones would be preferable for kettle hopping, right?
Yeah, and so we weren't just looking at the chemistry here. We were also dry hopping these in our unhopped base ale. What we found is that as you dry hopped with these later harvested hops, aroma intensity was increasing. The quality of that of that aroma was also changing, and so it was becoming more citrusy as you dry hopped with the later hops, whereas the earlier hops were more herbal in character and had less aromatic punch. And again, we're kind of relating or correlating here, so it's not exact causation. But what we found is that as you were using those later hops, they were higher in geraniol, higher in free precursors or free thiols. And so again, the thought is that there's more extractable volatiles that are actually important for dry hop flavor. There are more water soluble volatiles that are there.
And again, this is something that is not going to show up when a brewer goes out to hop selection and is trying to pick between different lots. You're not going to see that by rubbing and sniffing, right?
I think the challenge with the rub and sniff is that you have to know exactly what those water soluble compounds smell like, right? Because 60% of what you do the rub is made up of myrcene, or 60 to 70%, right? So unless you're very in tune to the particular aroma qualities of these water soluble volatiles, you might not know what you're looking for, right? And I think that's a challenge with the evaluation process. But that's not to say that you couldn't train yourself to the types of aroma qualities that might actually be driving this dry hop beer flavor. And I think, without analytical instrumentation or even knowing what these aroma compounds are, right? Because the science is kind of chasing brewers right now. Brewers have found these volatiles, which is I find really interesting, and so you do have or growers in that matter as well. So people with sensitive palates have been able to find these very unique aroma profiles, and I find that fascinating.
That was Scott LaFontaine and Tom Shellhammer here on the Master Brewers podcast. We only scratched the surface today. Go download the peer-reviewed papers from the Master Brewers Technical Quarterly and take your hoppy beers to the next level. Direct links are in the show notes, or you can always find over 50 years of archived technical quarterlies from the Publications tab at mbaa.com. We're taking this show on the road. I'll be talking yeast with Graham Stewart, dry hopping with Tom Shellhammer, Kvike yeast with Richard Priest, oxygen ingress on small canning lines with Brooke Bell, diastaticus detection with Matt Linsky, and so much more. Master Brewers Live is a brand new addition to the 2019 Master Brewers Conference, so grab your passport, get registered at mbaa.com, and join us in the Master Brewers Live studio October 31st and November 1st in Calgary. Check out the brand new Master Brewers Podcast website. You'll find guest profiles, information about upcoming live events, and more, all at masterbrewerspodcast.com. Are you enjoying the Master Brewers Podcast? Let me tell you about a simple way you can help us keep making more. Take a minute to thank our sponsors. There's no way we could produce this show without generous support from sponsors like Hopsteiner, ABS, Proximity Malt, BSG, and Malt Europe. So please, let them know you heard their message on the Master Brewers Podcast and that you appreciate their support.